Short video to take you through the core process in respect of coaching with the data. You'll remember from another video we talked about the core principles of not emailing the report and not presenting the report and the reasons for that. And we asked the question, were we ready to put on our coaching cap in engaging our client with the analytics? The reason for putting on our coaching cap rather than presenting is because we want to turn the dial on impact, insight, perceived value, also engagement. So in the pit stop, we've got massive levels of energy and engagement. We don't want to create a scenario when we're going through the analytics that we completely move away from that. We want to bring the best of that forward, even though we're getting into a thought process and a process of analysis that's a little bit more complex. So what we're going to share in this short video is a process to guide you through coaching with the data. So the core principle here is that when something is complex, it helps to break it down into its component parts. So let's do that with the Pitstop Analytics output. In particular, let's break it down into a number of different elements. And the most obvious ones are the pit board, the top of the model, performance design, team design, and the bottom of the model, performance dynamics. There are others, of course, but let's focus on the core ones, and the principle applies to the others too. Rather than landing the client and with a huge big report and all the analytics in one tranche, and dumping the data in a sense on them, we break it down into 3 coaching style conversations where we'll walk with them through the data in a process that marries analysis and reflection. So, as an example, our client has expressed a particular interest in design. We recommend you take the steps that are number 1 there in terms of walking through the pit board as an agenda setting item, but let's focus on number 2 here in terms of design. The same principles apply across all the sessions. So let's take design as an example. The client, the recommendation is to pause and ask the client when this is shown, when this particular page is shown within the analytics, to ask the client to read the text on the screen in order to set the context. So the coach facilitator simply remains quiet and lets the client read it, and then checks to make sure that it's obvious and clear what's there. So sticking with this page, we ask the client to run through the labels, then ask the client where they're expecting to see greens, reds, or ambers. So we walk through from left to right people in the right roles, right work, and we ask them what they're expecting to see in terms of the output. So I'm expecting to see, for example, a green on right people, green on right work, a green on right rewards, a green on right results. I think there might be an amber or 2 here, an amber around right roles. There may be a bit of confusion around that. We've just had an org change to right way. I think there's some issues there in terms of teaming, collaboration for sure. Right resources, there's a bit of a narrative around availability of resources. Some of that's true, some of it's a narrative. So we ask the client to walk through the labels, outlining what they're expecting to see, and revealing a little bit of their own thought process in doing so. And we make a note so that we can compare later on. So green, ambers, reds are there, noted with the G and A and so on. So after that, and allowing the client to talk through and share their thinking on that, we then reveal what the analytics is showing. So important here again that we give the client a moment to read and interpret the page for themselves. Simply, for example, by saying, maybe if I just give you a moment to read that and just look at the numbers that are coming out there. So we give the client space and time just to reflect on those, and then we begin to ask a number of questions. So for example, what do you think that this data is saying? How does this land on you? Important to pause after those questions, and indeed after the client's answer to those questions, in terms of allowing the client just to air their thoughts and to work their way through their thinking. So might continue. On similar questions such as, does anything jump out at you? Any surprises in there? How might others interpret this? And again, pausing regularly to allow people to maybe outline their thinking, even if they have stopped explaining something, maybe give a pause or two to allow them to continue on, maybe with something that they could additionally say that gets to how they're thinking or feeling about this particular aspect of performance design. Another useful pause point within sharing this part of the analysis is to ask the client to reflect back on how this compares with the output from the pit stop here, and in the capture tools from the pit stop you may have that immediately to hand in order to be able to refresh that. But of course, maybe the most interesting aspect of this is how is the reds and ambers and greens here reflected in the winning moves that have been selected from the pit stop. Does the analysis here support and validate the winning moves that have been selected? Or maybe perhaps it reveals something that didn't come up on the day, it was an undiscussable, or maybe it's a blind spot, and so on. So useful just to connect back with what happened in the pit stop and whether there was anything additional that came out there. So after having allowed the client to reflect on what the results have shown, interpret it, and ask them to how it's landed on them and so on, we then ask them where would they like to go next, and where would we like to zoom in on. So in this case, as often the case, the client zooms in on where the reds are. And again, in terms of revealing this next page, to pause for a moment and allow the client to read the page. So maybe if I just give you a moment to read the page, and then we can just check in with what it's telling us, might be telling us. So after the client has an opportunity to read the screen and checking that it's okay to move on, begin with a series of kind of probing questions again, such as, well, does anything jump out? Any surprises there? What do you think this data is saying? And again, pausing regularly to allow the client to not just analyze, but also to reflect. How does it land on you? How might others interpret this, or any other way of interpreting this? And after each area has been explored, asking the question, will we move on to the next area? Is there something that you would like to come back to here another time? Just checking that while we don't want to get drawn down into any particular area and not get to cover the totality, checking maybe that there are some items there that can be come back to in future. That might be future conversations or future coaching topics. So going to the next area, another area that was read, allowing the client to read it at their own time, checking that they've had enough time, and then asking similar questions again. Does anything jump out? Any surprises there? What do you think this data is saying? How does it land on you? How might others interpret this, and so on? So in scenarios, very, very rare, but a client says that can't be right. Client reacts to something that's on the page and says that can't be right, or surely that can't be true, or I think the typical response there is to pause, take a deep breath, and reply with, that's interesting. Could you tell me what you're thinking, or can you tell me a little bit more? And allow the client to work through and think through what it is that is going on with a particular number and a reaction to a number. Could be helpful also to say things such as, could there be anything else going on that has influenced how people rated this area? Remembering again that the analysis is the team's analysis, the team's data. This is what the team's perspective was. But of course, there's many ways to interpret the output, and we're really saying here is, how people interpreted this and engaged with it could be influenced by other factors, and to consider those. Might also say if the client is finding it difficult to reconcile any particular number with their perceived sense of the reality for their organization or team, maybe perhaps there's a false narrative within the team as represented by the data. That's a great opportunity, isn't it, in terms of if the data highlights something that people see one way, which the leader considers be counter to the reality of the situation, then it's a great opportunity for a conversation to be had. So when we've worked through the top of the model in this particular coaching-led data session, we then get to a point whereby stand back and take time to synthesize and reflect. This is particularly important, and it's important to manage time, I guess, to make sure that there is a little bit of time after working through the different pages and different outputs to pull it all together, to make sense out of it. So in terms of synthesis and reflection, it continues the questioning process here in terms of how do you feel about the data? Having gone through the design section, how do you feel about the data? What's landed on you? What are the main points that you'd pull out? Are there any questions raised by the analysis? What do you want to do next, or as a result of this data? Also probe around whether there's more information needed, a conversation to be had as a result of it, a decision to be taken, an area for improvement, an action that may be required or set of actions, and in particular, if there's anything that they need from you as the coach or consultant in this area. Then, before concluding this particular session, to connect back in and check engagement with the process overall and to signpost the next steps. And that involves checking with the client about the pace, whether there was enough time or whether it took longer than expected, whether the result generated, we'll know of course from the previous questions whether the result generated any surprise or opened any eyes or identified any specific actions. And that's great too if it doesn't. If an area just confirms that something is fine and that it's not a priority at this time, and that we're reconciled in terms of how the individuals within the organization see things and how the leader sees things, that's cool too. And maybe it illuminates that the next area might be dynamics, which may illuminate other aspects that may be of more interest to a leader or less interest to a leader. So we're checking engagement, reconnecting, recontracting in terms of the process overall, and signposting the next steps. You'll find lots more information and guides and steps at the Resources Center. That includes step-by-step instructions and a range of frequently asked questions.